generated a great deal of conversation for folks. So at this point, I'm going to bring up Chris O'Donovan. I'm going to bring him up. He's already up.
Okay.
I did. Thank you, everybody. Chris O'Donovan. Chris comes to us from Shire, where he's a director of resource analytics. He spent his career at Covance and a little bit of time at BMS, a little bit further back, kind of straddling IT and the business, which I think is something that will probably resonate with a bunch of folks, given the topic that brings us together here. So please give a warm welcome to Chris.
All right. 47 years ago, we embarked on a journey to create a perfect dashboard, and I will say that we're continuing that journey without an end in sight. Presentation's a little bit evolved from a discussion that I had with my buddy Jeff over there and Matt, where he kind of said, I dare you to start a presentation with that. And then I thought back, all right, well, that was Abe Lincoln. The Gettysburg Address, I'm going to one-up you on that one and say, all right, something from the Emancipation Proclamation. And it got me thinking about amalgamation, putting things together, putting the country together, putting data together. And what I realized over the years is the demands are changing, right? And what turned out, as sort of like a joke and a quip back at Jeff turned into, I can really start to think about how the evolution of the business has occurred in the BI space, right? What's actually happened on the IT front, what's happened on the business unit front, how are things changing, how is technology changing, how is data structures changing, right? How does the job of a data scientist or a BI professional change, right? Where do they sit? How do the organizations actually function, and how do we provide value? It really is an incredibly exciting place to be, I think, in the industry, and especially following Matt's talk. You kind of see what the capabilities are, and to a certain degree how backwards a lot of how we actually conduct business. This talk is going to be geared somewhat towards the tactical use of BI tools and suites. In terms of looking at some of like the more innovative use of large integrated networks, Hadoop systems, right? Really complex BI, true big data management. I'm going to take a little bit of a step back from that. But just to give a little bit of background about myself, I've been at Shire Pharmaceuticals for 3 years. It's been a heck of a 3 years in amongst deploying $45 billion worth of capital towards acquiring companies, integrating companies, bringing assets in, killing assets, looking at how we actually resource our portfolio, as well as how we actually use intelligence to drive the decisions to progress or kill things within our pipeline. So very interesting from that front. Prior to my years at Shire, I worked for about 7 years at Covance. And from a background, I started with Matt and Jeff in resource planning, where we were looking to solve some constraint issues, right, which really started to take us down a data path. And I would say that instead of being truly the digital native, going through the traditional IT data science background, I kind of learned from the business and quickly acclimated myself to the IT group and started to see that there was major gaps, right, in how we actually can engage technologies to actually drive business forward. So what I want to really talk about today is a couple of things. Just a little bit of a background on what we're seeing with executives today and what they're bombarded with, and really to piggyback on what Matt had said, giving the example of, well, I just want my integrated dashboard. I want to see my portfolio, right? And coming from a company who has been integrating companies, and we've acquired 7, 8, 9 companies in the last 3 years, and then having to put those pieces together to get those consolidated views is a particular frame of reference that touches home with me. I want to go through a little bit about, I'm going to start with strategic and tactical intelligence, because I think that there's a real difference between the two in understanding, where the industry has gone, sort of, what we can look at, to drive business decisions based largely on internal information versus looking at the universe of information and the universe of possibilities when you start looking at integrated networks, machine learning, and all that type of thing. The evolution of where BI tools have come from, sort of what they are and how that impacts how we actually deliver BI solutions, tools, reports, dashboards, and things of that nature. And then, from an organizational perspective, everybody's going to make a decision as to how analytics gets done. Are we going to centralize the function? Are we going to decentralize? Are we going to have centers of excellence? So there's a lot of, it can be done any number of different ways, and there's pros and cons to both. So I want to just kind of talk to you guys a little bit about that and how that works. And then really, how do you create practical business value out of BI tools, right? At the end of the day, if you go back to, massive ERP implementations, 30 million here, 50 million there, right? To implement, an SAP system, or, you look at any of the resource planning, Planisware, OPX2, right? I'm sure a lot of you guys have probably been through those monstrous efforts. So the question becomes, how from a strategic and tactical perspective can we actually deliver practical business value, right? And capitalize on the investments that we're making in our IT infrastructure or our data infrastructure, and processes to support those things. So, what do the business leaders hear? I mean, if you guys have looked at, any business publication out there, you're going to see, plenty of these, word maps, right? Say like what data, analytics, big data analytics, right? I need consolidation, right? Some of my particular favorites, are, general analysis, right? I need this, I need metrics, I need all sorts of different things. So the question is, okay, if you're bombarded with this and you're told that you need this and you have no idea, necessarily how to use it, right? How does this get delivered to you in a way that's particularly valuable, right? So really, what you're told exactly is what Matt had said, is that we just need to put this together. I need to see consolidation. I need you to amalgamate all this stuff, mash it together, and provide this intelligence that I so desperately am told I need, right? So I can further my decision making, right, and make data-driven or informed decisions based upon factors that are relevant to my particular situation. So, having been, the one who has to receive the I need, the question then drives to, well, why? What do you need? Why do you need it? Right? Do we need to, put together the universe of information to drive a decision that may not require the universe, right, to actually deliver, right? And furthermore, if I deliver that universe of information to you via some massively complex navigational dashboard with tendrils out to 15 different systems that can get you to any piece of metadata possible, how valuable is that, right? Does that truly provide what the business needs in terms of delivering the ability to actually make an informed decision versus stagnate and ruminate, across a decision or sort of a paradigm before you can actually move forward and do something. So amalgamation became a really a relevant topic because it's, how do we do this, right? And I like to kind of think of it in terms of strategic and tactical, and it's important to really make this, the distinction. They can be, shown together, right? I would say that there's arguments for it, there's arguments against it because it can be confusing. But, when you kind of think of how these play together, it's like strategic are generally the slow-moving items, right? They're big picture, right? I don't necessarily need real-time data to do my strategy. A particular example, of sort of delivering tactical information, to try to drive strategy is, it was, Carrie Sternberg, one of the heads of the business units within my company. So I get these reports, right? There's like an army of people that feed me these reports, right? This is supposed to help me drive the strategy. I don't have time for the reports. I can't deal with the reports, right? And I know that these things are incredibly costly for me to actually get all the time because of the effort that's required to drive the process, to generate the data, to do the analytics, to actually deliver the report, and assume that I'm going to use this to make a decision. I can't use it. Why are we doing this, right? So, again, from a long-term perspective, if your strategy is changing all the time, I kind of think of it as saying, okay, I got to get from point A to point B, right? If I took a tactical approach, I'd see a data point, I'd go this way, then I 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 go that way, right? Versus kind of saying my strategy to get me, all right, I'll do a course correction along the way, maybe a little bit, and I'll get from point A to point B a heck of a lot faster, right? So again, understanding the strategic and tactical use of information is particularly important. And again, we'll drive the strategies you have in forming the data layers, semantic layers, of the information that's ultimately going to be put out to the business to drive the decisions. Strategic stuff is generally the proactive. It's the thinking man's game. It's the, I'm going to plan to do this versus the tactical, which oftentimes, I mean, you can, be forward-looking in your tactical information, but ultimately, usually it's reactive. Are you reporting on what's happened, right? Or are you predicting what's going to happen, right? Generally, so you can, keep control of something versus saying, okay, I can use a bunch of tactics to then drive a strategy. And when I think of, really the strategic, again, I'll go back to, to Matt and looking at, the internal and the external, right? One of my favorite grad school examples was, when, laptops were, getting big and, back, in the 80s and 90s, and you say, all right, well, IBM looked and said, well, how are we doing? We asked that, that had a laptop, we're doing great. We grew by 100% this year. Right, and you say, all right, well, that's fantastic. We grew by 100% this year, except that the industry is growing by 30%, so you're losing your shirt, or 300%, so you're losing your shirt. Right, in terms of, thinking you're doing well by establishing internal benchmarks versus actually doing the external and establishing strategy versus the actual tactical deployment of saying, yeah, sure, 100% is great, except that, does your tactics and your strategy link up? And really think, like, what's your mindset, right? I like Matt's comments about the innovator, right? Versus, you can have like a delivery person, you can have an innovator, the person who's going to think of that overarching message, right? And you need them all, right? Because ultimately the business has to run, you've got to push the ball forward, you've got to make decisions, and you've got to think about tomorrow, right? So understanding how these things, work in the paradigm of, business intelligence, data collection, data visualization, and communication styles, techniques, and technologies is incredibly important. So really, like, what have we seen from the evolution of BI? I mean, it's if you go back a long, long time ago before computers, what did people do? You had ledgers and you had people that, added and subtracted, and then you got calculators and, things got, a little bit better and you could derive more insights. And then you started getting these mainframe computers and, all these things where you could, put data together. And then you had databases, right? But where are we now, right? That stuff, once we started to get into computing, IT driven, right? And the question always became, what's the connection between IT and the business? Are you the techie guy who's going to be hands down looking at the system, making sure it's functional? Or are you going to understand how that tool can actually be used to really, drive the business to do something? Right? Are you providing information? Are you providing data? Or are you providing intelligence? And really, like, the building up of data to the point where it's intelligence, became really difficult, because to bridge that gap between an IT professional and a business professional speaking the same language is typically a difficult challenge. There's a select few people, I think, that have the ability to truly interact with business, understand how to extract value from the business, and use sort of like the ideas and the concepts to really drive an organization to move forward. But it's gone now from the tools that we have. You've got all these desktop software, right? The Tableaus, I use Click, I've used Spotfire, all the rest of it, where I can connect to anything, right? I don't need IT, really, to do much of anything other than provide me a pipe to a data source, right? And how many organizations have massive ERP systems that are run on Excel, right? Because it's just so difficult to actually use that information. How many people report, using integrated web-based technologies? Even though there's the drive to move towards it, I would challenge people to say, well, what percentage of it is truly information passed via, graphs, charts, Excel, right? Little thing via email versus truly adopting, the power of what these technologies can offer. Things being coded versus drag and drop. Once you've got to the point where you don't need to lay down code anytime you want to move a widget on a dashboard, I mean, how powerful is that? People can get customized visualizations versus saying, okay, these are the canned reports. You want a report? Okay, the IT department's got, a 6-month backlog of all the other reports they've got to create for the rest of the business. A lot of this problem goes away, but it doesn't come at a cost. Things going from file-based to web published, right? Again, how many emails do you guys get passed around versus how many emails are completely made unnecessary by being able to access a link on a web page, right? And then thinking of that being a static versus a dynamic environment. I'm not just giving you a static report where I've got to deduce something. I can actually, on the fly, look at something particularly of value to me, right? So really, the end game, the users, whether they're technologically inclined or not, or whether they have the understanding of being able to look at a graph or a chart and derive the same insights that you might be able to, right? The fact is that you don't know what your users are going to be looking like when they go to a dynamic environment, right? You can provide a view, right? But ultimately, the view that they're going to be looking at based upon the slices and the dice and the insights that they can derive, foster a whole new level of communication that's required to really put together or amalgamate all the insights that are derived by these BI tools and systems. So, and then what we've also started seeing, again, Matt referred to the mashups and the smash-ups, right? Anybody can do a mashup in Tableau, right? As long as you have a basic understanding of how to put two data sets together and say, yes, this project equals that project, we map it together, it plays nice, we're good, right? But you take a look at even where it's going further down the line, you don't need relational databases. When you start looking at NoSQL databases in Mongo and all these massive loops and parallel computing, right? Being able to truly do that data science and change the paradigm of how we do drug development, again, there's sort of what we need to drive decisions versus what we need to drive strategy, right? And I would say, again, keeping those two things somewhat separate, understand what are the needs of the consumers, right? At the end of the day, when I need a portfolio report, it doesn't necessarily mean I need to go out and re-strategize my BI strategy, right? So, but again, the capabilities have gone from IT-centric, sort of slow, to very much individual-centric, right? And really you could have, in-function business experts becoming incredibly powerful individuals, right? So, the general outcomes is that 18 months, I can whip together a dashboard in 10 minutes, right? Just give me access to the data, I can throw it up in Click, Spotfly, or anything like that. I can help you start to derive insights, right? The whole idea of how we do system development and BI development. I worked on traditional IT waterfall projects where, we're going to do our functional requirements and we're going to do our detailed requirements and we're going to have our functional UAT and all this other stuff, right, to figure out how things work versus being able to say, tell me what your problem is, right? Acutely what your problem is, and let's think about ways that we can actually put certain pieces of information together that exist within my universe or my locus of control, right? Pull out the pieces that are relevant to you. We'll mock some, and not even mock it up. We'll put something together to quickly drive value. We can develop it, we can deploy it, and I can do it without calling anybody in IT, right? So that's huge in terms of the productivity gains, the ease of sharing and dissemination. Again, but they do come at costs, right? Data security, data breaches, right? The wrong information getting out. We're popping holes through firewalls. There's all sorts of different things that we've got to consider where we can't leave IT out of the loop. But in the same regard, the end user, the business analyst, the person who's actually driving the insights and putting together those mashups, amalgamating the data at the request or behest of a particular executive, it becomes easy. So again, roles are generally trending out of IT departments. Now, in terms of what I've seen, is with that shift of sort of the ability for a user to actually provide value independent of IT, you start seeing these centralized groups becoming decentralized. In some organizations, that you can operate under either one of the models. There's pros and cons to both, right? I'll start with the decentralized. One is, you talk about subject matter experts and data experts. If you've got somebody who's physically sitting within a business unit, lives it day to day, truly understands what's going on, right? That functional alignment, gives them much more visibility into what is going to provide value, versus having an intermediary react with a centralized group. Have somebody who may or may not have that expertise, right? Functional alignment, right? Who's doing it potentially as a job shop, right? So definitely a pro there. The operational knowledge and alignment, right? In terms of, really, the tandem there is with the resource constraints and bandwidth, right? There's only so many people, so many FTEs that business is willing to put towards this stuff. If the function owns the FTEs, they can tell them what to do. This is what I want you to focus on, versus queuing up the work, right? Say, okay, well, I can't tell you how many times where I say, oh, we need a project. We're gonna have to go to governance. We're gonna have to, create a project. We're gonna have to commit funds, versus saying, hey Chris, I've got this problem. Can you just go take a look at some of this data here, right? Put what you have together, right? And let's see if we can deliver some immediate value. So again, speed, resource constraints, right? But the problem that you have is a lot of times when you've got different people functionally deployed into the business, you start establishing silos, private data sets, right? Things like that. So you go from sort of like the old silo, and then we put everything into a warehouse, and now we're going back out to a system where, what's the authoritative data? Is it Chris's data set, right? Is it something that he pulled from a repository, massaged, tweaked, did something like that, and you say, all right, well, in the same right, that person might have limited visibility into the scope of the universe of data available, right? So you still need some, the ability to traverse the organization, provide cross-functional views into, really the true wealth of data that might exist in a company. So you might say, okay, well that puts you towards more of a centralized. Or do you have both? Do you have sort of like a centralized? Now I look where I work, and I'm part of a corporate development organization under corporate, right? I can look down and sort of each one of the different functions pull information together, right? So you do have more of a cross-functional, holistic approach, right? And then do you create centers of excellence, right? Do you create little think tanks or work groups or workshops within an organization to functionally drive efficiencies? A lot of different strategies you can do to make the decentralized model effective, and in the same right, take the centralized model and potentially make it more effective. But functionally speaking, do you want the consultative approach, or really are you looking at sort of the dedicated, very focused? But again, very focused can also lead to tunnel vision, and from an innovation perspective, sometimes it can be difficult to jump out of that box and provide the macro value to an organization, really the paradigm shifting analytics that are going to drive a completely different view of how we actually move a portfolio, a company, right, an R&D organization forward. What about IT and all this? If we're saying that there's sort of like a shift, I guess the question back to you guys, who actually sits within an IT organization versus business function? Do you guys you guys seeing this happening, right? The big I've been called many things. One of which is my favorite, which is I'm shadow IT, right? You've got all this idea. So these people have no idea what they're getting into. They've got no idea about data federation. They've got no idea about how to actually interact with data across a commercial scale organization and provide those analytics. And then
I was just saying, the only other pitfall I'd add is that people who in business get going, and then they get stuck, and that's really one of the critical. I think we could add that one.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was going with these two.
But there's also one other thing, okay, and it's really a concern to those companies, and that is when you look at IT, our budgets are under constraints. That's the first thing that gets cost cut.
Yep.
When you talk about, I'm not going to call it shadow IT, but you talk about business enablement, that money is hidden.
Yeah.
That money is hidden,
Yeah.
and as well as the compliance risks and everything else that go along with it.
Yeah. So there you go. There's a million different things that you can consider, and that's why I like to, I've been on both sides of the coin, right? It's funny. I started out, Jeff and I, we were shadow IT. It was, there was problems. They needed analytics. Things started in Excel. Then it was, all right, let's prototype something, and then turn it to Excel working with Access. And in the end, it turned into a full-blown IT project to build a resource planning system, full algorithms, all the, the whole 9 yards, right? Everything became federated. Had its challenges, but once things come above board, you realize, okay, this is great. This can be an absolutely functional partnership. Except that, do you also get these people work under a different set of rules than we do, right?
Go back to his cost point. The other problem is that once it's done, let's say you finish it all the way.
Yep.
Who runs it? Who supports it? Who gives the help desk? Who gives the training? Who gives the access?
Yep.
And it just goes on and on.
Unsupported tools. I found a better job, I left the company. Subject matter expert's gone. This thing is dead, right? So those are the risks that we have realistically with, okay, we've got desktop BI tools that are massively parallel, right? Built on the knowledge that's in one guy's head, right? With no real means of documentation. Nobody's going through a full system life cycle plan, right? Anything like that. It's like, you know what, there's a problem, I need to deliver it. But these are the pros and cons, and this is what we've got to weigh as an organization to drive decisions. You say, all right, can I wait 18 months? In which case, all right, I'm dead in the water for 18 months. Can I spend 8 times the amount of money to do it and make it ironclad and robust, right? And you've got to say, how many of these things are one-time ad hoc throwaways, right? Do a cut of the data versus saying, I'm building a transactional system around a process that's going to involve many people where if it breaks, the business is screwed, right? And that's where you've got to make the decision as to say, okay, how am I going to implement my BI solution, right? You look at how, the evolution, like Matt showed that, the one, and we're going down that path of how do you put the social side, right, into the actual commentary. I'm working on a monthly report refresh project right now where we say, okay, let's look at all the programs in our pipeline, right, and all of our inline programs, anything on the market. What's going on in development? What are the risks? What are the issues, right? We had paper report, right, Word documents, right, and then you'd say, all right, well, how do I glean intelligence from that across a portfolio if I've got to either run text searches or something like that are largely unreliable unless you've got really cool tools, versus saying, all right, I'm going to compartmentalize the data, right? And say, okay, I'm going to capture all my risks and issue logs and all the rest of it, have everything consolidated, let people slice and dice in any way, shape, or form they want, right? Bring true risks up to the top, reprioritize, all those types of things. Right, so you look at how that project alone is going to be touching hundreds of people, right? It oftentimes will start out with, let me see a conceptual visualization of what a new monthly report would look like, and that's what we started as, to say, what's missing from the process, rapid prototyping, and then engagement of IT partners. So understanding how the two sides have got to play nice in the sandbox, and then say, I hate system documentation. It drives me nuts. I can't stand all the signatures and all the rest of it. I get it. Right? It's just that I'm an innovative, I want to be on the forefront of innovation. I don't want to be saddled, so to speak, with all the stuff that makes sure that this thing is going to be robust in the long term. Right? So this is like a real partnership, and what about traditional IT? If like these things aren't integrated, right? If the business can't play nice in the sandbox, or the business analyst can't play nice in the sandbox, right, you're dead in the water. So it's the obligation of both sides to make it a collaborative, cohesive environment, and not sort of, shame that you don't have to do the documentation I do, you don't get it, right? I'm not expensive, I'm just thorough, right? That kind of thing. So there's pitfalls, right? And it's interesting when you start deploying these, especially when you say that, all right, if individual, and this is what I've seen too, individual business units will say, well, I want this software. They go out, they buy it, COTS, right? And deploy it, and then IT will try to lock it down, right? And say, no, you can't, install anything without administrator rights. And then some VP will come and say, well, thou shalt not halt my business, and thou shalt undo that administrative right constraint. And they put this in, right? But again, unsupportable, right? And is it sustainable? Does it have business value? Absolutely, right? Potential for massive business value, but it comes with risks, right? Perfect segue into business value. And one of the things that I like to say, like what do BI groups actually do? Whether they're deployed or they're centralized, what do they actually do? And it's really the actionable intelligence to drive decisions, right? Whether you're using big data or you're reporting on milestones, right? You're doing some sort of a panel data set analysis, portfolio, whatever you may be doing, right? You're providing actionable. If it's not actionable, if it's like just data, I'm just giving you data. One of the things that I used to kill me is that you realize when your visualizations are bad, when somebody goes into like any app or something like that you've created and you provided the ability to them to actually get the underlying data, right? And if you actually look to see where they go, they don't even bother, they just go right to the data, pull the data down and do what they want with it, right? Completely ineffective visualization. And I can't tell you how, it's like you say, but I did all this work for you based upon all your requirements and right? But clearly, there's how people are using the data, and it's really the job. And that, again, centralized, decentralized. If you don't know how or why people are actually doing that, whose fault is that, right? You don't understand the value of the creation that we're missing, right? Some of this is identify risks. These tools are awesome at identifying risks, right? If you've got somebody who's really creative with algorithms and metrics and stuff like that. But I looked at what we did with metrics a couple of years ago. Metrics, now it's analytics, right? Before it was like a couple of years ago it was metrics. I need to see metrics. The people tell me about these things, metrics. I know I need them, right? And I need my metrics on my dashboard. And then you see these dashboards with 500 metrics on them, right? 57 red lights, and you say, All right, if you look at adult learning, right, and visual cognition, how many discrete pieces of information can an adult human actually process at any one given point in time and then use that to make a decision, right? It's scarily low, right? You look at just short-term memory. People can hold in short-term memory generally 7 pieces of information, plus or minus a couple, right? But when you look at just visual processing, right, if you see 4 red lights on the dashboard, your body, your brain is like, holy cow, there's 4 red lights, and then it becomes a competition with your brain. So like in terms of the psychology of all this, there's a ton of that goes into it, right? I mean, I've been the data amalgamation problem is like, all right, I've got this universe of data, just give me it all, right? Now what? You've got it all, right? But you gotta ask yourself, is the juice worth the squeeze? Putting this thing together, right, the cost of it, the aggravation, right, going through this, the business value that you're actually creating, is it worth it? In the end. And you can say from truly innovative analytics, outside the box thinking, stuff that is necessarily going to be driving future strategy, you need to do data exploration. You need to put disparate things together. You need to drive inference from these mashups. But the question becomes, from a lot of the tactical use of these things and general information or intelligence dissemination, right, is it worth it, right? When I was at Covance, I used to tell people, look, there's $1 million sitting underneath every stone, and I'm standing on Pebble Beach. Which one do I want to pick up, right? And from a pickup perspective, you say, all right, well, but if by the time I can actually reach down and pick up that stone, it cost me $2 million, I might as well not even have bothered, right? I picked up the wrong stone. So being able to really assess the value of what we're providing is huge, right? And I've seen plenty of things that people had no clue what the value was until that eureka moment happened. And they're like, oh. And you look at, Covance, and that's how Accelerate was born, right? Was we looked at a couple of different things and it was, wow. All right, if we started putting this, and this together, we can really, truly optimize site selection, right? And all these other things, on driving clinical trial efficiency. But it took, massive, political effort to get something like that done. Jeff, you remember that. All right. And let's see, how much time do I have, Matt? I got a couple minutes?
Yeah, that's good.
All right. The fundamentals, right? Again, picking up that stone and finding $1 million, right? What's the value proposition, right? Who's this for, right? Is it fit for purpose, or are we putting together this massive cockpit, right? That ultimately you need, a complete data scientist jockey to even remotely understand what's going on, right? And then again, from your organizational design structure, you say, all right, am I addressing cross-functional needs, right? Do I have any overlap, right? Once you decentralize these things, the redundancy that you experience, in data dissemination can be huge, right? And the other thing too is, once you realize something's outgrown its useful life, kill it, right? I mean, again, I'll take my Perry Sternberg example where it's, these reports were there for his predecessor. Right, he received the reports, and finally, I mean, I don't know. It's great that you've got all these reports, except that they're completely useless. With the cadence at which they're delivering them. So you either reduce the cadence, or you decide what to actually do to reduce the burden on the organization of producing. Right, because at the end of the day, what a lot of people don't realize is the army of people that are required to put together the data that's ultimately going to be driving some of the dashboards that you're going to see floating around. And this is like the critical one, is assume your customers do not have the same analytic skills you do. I know most of the people in this room are going to be pretty technical, right? I love data. I've got a very spatial mind. I can look at things and put them together. It's kind of like fun for me to actually envision these puzzles and how I might combine something to create a novel analytic. You can't expect that of your consumers, right? You absolutely have to make sure that, what you're presenting is completely relevant to what they have, and it's in such a way where the insights cannot necessarily be inferred. Let people derive their own, but because again, once you've got that dynamic nature, right, people can then start to view cuts that you may have not been able to visualize, but again, that feedback loop becomes massively important. Don't clutter these things. I see it again. The data amalgamation. Put it all together. I want to see it all. I want to see 57 drill downs to the nth degree of an ass. And you're just like, well, what's the sense in this, right? Does the VP of, your R&D organization really care about the data point, a single data point that's driving, from a patient visit in a clinical trial, right, that is within the scope of a clinical trial, which is within a program, which is within a BU, right, et cetera. And when you start looking at these cascades, though it can be incredibly valuable to have this information drillable, right, providing, that ready access to the information, right, via the distribution mechanisms you establish is important to be custom catered to the audience, because again, you'll get dropped like a rock, right? If it's not intuitive, if it's not simple, if it doesn't fit the purpose, as it was, required by the consumer, all the drill downs and cool, tendrils and stuff.
Yeah, I guess the key driver for that is whether it's free for them or not. So if it's free, yeah, let it roll, but if all of a sudden you say, well, that'll be another X, Y, Z,
Yep.
10X.
Yeah, which again, you've got the, clearly articulate the value proposition, which truly is a value, cost, rock, not gonna bother, right, that kind of thing. And then again, don't assume that big data equals big dashboards, right? That big data, that's such a cool word, and it gets so much buzz, and it's like when you look at the word map, or the word cloud up front, it's like big data analytics, right? It's in everybody's the front of mind, and of course it's it's trendy, and in terms of what these systems can cost, right? Both in acquisition, setup, maintenance, right? Training, delivery can be massive, right? So when you start saying, okay, well, now I'm just going to provide you all this stuff, you actually diminish the value, that you actually gain by having these systems, by throwing too much in there. And again, we're all about effective communication, right? If this dashboard gives me anything I could ever hope to see under any circumstance versus turn left, which is more effective, right? If all it's really needed, is a decision to say do this, why the hell would you bother going through all the aggravation to put together that thing to hopefully have the guy, not be distracted by the 57,000 other things on there that don't say turn left, right? Find out what people need to know and tell them, right? Yeah, and again, from a risk perspective, really, the more data you have, the more I think a lot of us as data scientists are guilty of I'm just gonna throw everything at the wall and see what sticks up there, and you get these mega dashboards, right? When you start throwing things together, particularly in BI tools that don't have data federation sitting behind them, what do you get, right? Difficult to ensure data quality, right? It's like, all right, what's the timeliness of data? It's like if I got a monthly report that's based on 5 data sources that are based on 5 different processes for updates, right? That are by no means timely, can I truly get a snapshot of what's going on in the portfolio for an executive level report? Understanding what the business needs, and and the reason I bring that up is that we do executive reporting that goes out to Wall Street on our pipeline, right? If those things don't jive, right, I don't have a job, So, and in terms of like being sure that, it goes to process, it's hugely important, right? When I'm working, so I do, functional due diligence, on our resource planning through our acquisition process, right? We've got processes in place, and after these deals go through and I get Deloitte calling me up saying, okay, tell me about the process, tell me about this, tell me about that, right? If that doesn't exist, it's sort of like, I just did it this way because I felt like it. That's not a good answer, right? When you just spend $6 billion on an asset, right? So it does come with its risks, and having these, deployed, easy access BI tools that can sit on somebody's desktop and connect to anything, right? And again, I mentioned this mixing strategic and tactical information, is definitely one of those confusing factors. It's, what are we using this to drive, right? Really understand the needs of the consumers and drive analytics for it. And because the ease of development, of a lot of these, tool sets is there, right? It's drag and drop. I can it's amazing, how few people know how to really use pivot tables, right? But they can take one of these things and, and go with it, right? And it's like, wow, like the power is pretty incredible, except that if you're doing the wrong thing, you don't have the, the true underlying, data, information, right? And sort of what this stuff is all about from a process perspective, can lead to some very scary results, right? So, I think the keys that I wanted you guys to leave here from me is that, amalgamation, like in putting stuff together, it's the future of computing. How we do it, how we capture it, right? How we structure the data, and how we can derive real, true insights to drive decisions are huge, right? But that ability to have that self-service side of it is shifting, the way think tanks are formed, right? Operational business intelligence groups are, right? Individual analysts being deployed to businesses, right? So keep that in mind, when you're navigating the organizations, in terms of, if you're sitting if you're looking down and saying, well, wow, I see where the logical touch points are, right? Make sure those things happen, right? One of my favorite examples was, years ago, I put together, just a spider diagram saying, okay, metrics, right? Sitting in the middle of a brainstorm diagram. And Pascal, there's 7 metrics projects going on, right? Deploying teams of people, right? The overlap on the underlying data that was required to actually drive these things was so massive, it was unbelievable, right? And the inconsistency in which they were actually calculating and deriving these things was unbelievable, right? So when you start having that, when you've got somebody who can look and say, wow, this is what's going on, and reduce that redundancy, that's where the IT organizations will oftentimes lay down the hammer and say, hey guys, you gotta think about this, right? And the business says, no, we can't slow us down. It's a difficult dance. There's a lot of politics involved. There's a lot of communication. Ultimately, you need, really coordination to make this whole BI evolution successful within an organization to deliver the types of value that it truly can in making the drug development process, right, more efficient. And the last thing is, really, intelligence isn't putting all the data together, right? It's putting the right stuff together, right? Amalgamating everything isn't going to solve your problems.
So how do you figure out what the right data is? Do you go to the stakeholders and pretty much ask them what they want?
That's a good question. That's really the bridge between, I think I had it in here, and one of them was, I like to separate investigative or exploratory analytics, right, from that which is going to sort of be consumed on a more mass scale, right? It's kind of like, a lot of times I'll evolve, a product or a dashboard or a way of thinking based upon the kinds of questions that I'm getting. That's why I always try to drive fit for purpose, right? But fit for purpose doesn't mean the purpose doesn't change tomorrow, right? These things are, evolutionary, and, the ability to actually use these tools, right, and quickly modify, change views, change dimensions, right, change measures, right, aggregate this way, correlate that way. Some of it is just flat out creativity. I like puzzles, right? I like to, sort of in my mind visualize how I might be able to do something. Can everybody do that? No, right? Can a lot of the execs that I do work with? No, but as data analysts and the kinds of people who have that business knowledge, right, and kind of traverse that IT wall and being able to really put things together, it's one of those powerful skill sets. It's really, I think, the next generation of how we deliver the BI solutions.
Can you talk about the commentary workflow, because I see that as a huge change. Because right now the whole thing is actionable intelligence, right?
Yeah.
So okay, so you put this up, and I won't even go into the processes of work, but let's just leave that aside for a moment. Assuming that there's just an anomaly that needs to be explained, it has to be actioned. When did that action actually occur? Do you see anything that you particularly? I don't see any tools right now. I saw that Matt talked earlier on that, because a couple of Flip just made some mention inside the new and printing tool about that, but we're really struggling with that problem. We built a custom one, but it's kind of hokey because we did it on the Oracle Apex, but it it's something that's huge demand, but people say, well, okay, well, so who cares if it's out of line, what
Yeah.
are we doing about it?
Yeah, and that whole idea of data annotation is huge, right? You know, so how do you flag something? You know, I mean, I kind of bring it back to, I remember when Microsoft came out with OneNote, right? Back in, when did I use it? It was a long time ago. It was like 2004 or 5, right? I used one of like the original tablet computers. I remember using it. I was like, holy cow, this is like unbelievable. You know, I can cross-reference, mark, tag, and all the rest of it. Very slow adoption of that tool, right? You know, more so in the academic space, but when you look at, you know, the ability to annotate particular pieces of information, something like that was well ahead of its time. How we actually can connect that back to original data, right? You know, and have that relational within your environments, I think there's a huge opportunity. And to your point, that's where, you know, I see we're doing custom stuff. You've got end printing. You know, we can go back. Are we staging our data warehouses differently? Am I creating sort of like pseudo comment tables that then relate back to individual data points? I don't have a good answer to that one yet because I am navigating that problem today. But the social side of it, you know, and when you think of just what social networks do, you know, and groupthink, right, you know, and, you know, coming to communities of, you know, of knowledge and intelligence, it's really fascinating as to where it can go. It can lead you down really great paths, but it can also lead you down scary paths because, you know, when you're going really down on like the true bleeding edge of, you know, sort of thought leadership, you know, you can't necessarily use the paradigms of the old to, you know, to translate into the new. So, you know, it's an interesting dance, and I'm happy to be where I am so I can actually see it happen.
All right, Chris, thanks all.
Thank you.